The morning of the Flaxborough Horticultural Society's annual spring flower show began in the usual manner, with Mrs. Trelawney fussing over her roses in the back hall of the town hall, and Mr. Percy Crabbe muttering about the disappearance of his best dahlias. Outside, a thin mist lingered over the cobbled market square, giving the place a sort of soft focus air that suited the town's modest ambitions. Inside, the hall smelled of damp bouquets, polishing wax, and just a hint of something more combustible Mrs. Trelawney's temper. Chairs scraped against the polished floor as exhibitors arranged vases with the precision of a bank clerk lining up coins, while the rest of Flaxborough's civic-minded curious hovered, exchanging the week's gossip in hushed, earnest tones. Among them, Inspector Purbright stood unobtrusively near the sideboard, eyeing the proceedings with that quiet patience which gave him a look of perpetual, mild amusement. He had arrived early to indulge in what he referred to privately as the sociological preliminaries, noting the placement of the exhibits, the small ticks of the competitors, and the way the hall's light bounced off a certain shade of ribbon. It was during the Raffle, a customary interlude meant to raise funds for the society's heating bills, that the first truly peculiar incident occurred. The prize, a silver teapot of respectable size and modest elegance, was to be drawn by Mrs. Elfrida Pargeter, the widow who had recently moved from the more urbane precincts of Nottinghamshire. She had been the subject of considerable local interest ever since she had arrived in her dark, slightly too grand carriage and been seen shopping for lace curtains that would have swallowed half the high street. When Mrs. Pargeter reached into the small wicker basket containing the tickets, her hand froze. She looked momentarily startled, as though a thought had struck her mid-air. Then she withdrew a ticket and, with an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, announced the winning number. It was her own. The hall froze for a breathless moment. A polite cough here, a shuffle of feet there. Mr. Crabbe muttered something about rigged odds under his breath, while Mrs. Trelawney's eyes narrowed with the faint suspicion of historical grievance. Murmurs rippled through the audience, gaining speed and colour in the usual Flaxborough manner. Purbright, as always, said nothing. Instead, he made a note of the subtle reactions, the faint twitch of Mrs. Pargeter's left eyelid, the mild blanching of the tea committee chairman, the rapid exchange of glances among those standing closest to the basket. Not one of them seemed willing to accuse her openly, yet almost everyone had already decided a version of the story for themselves. By the time the raffle concluded and the teapot was presented with all the ceremonial gravity that the society could muster, whispers had solidified into the first of Flaxborough's inevitable gossip waves. "Lucky, I call it," said Mrs. Trelawney, her voice both condemning and fascinated, "though you might call it more than that." "And what, pray, would that be?" Purbright asked gently. "Oh, nothing, Inspector," she said with a tight smile that suggested exactly the opposite. Outside, the mist was lifting, leaving the square glistening under the tentative sunlight. Inside, the flower show carried on, but the teapot rested in Mrs. Pargeter's hands like a small, quiet scandal waiting to bloom. And as Purbright later remarked to himself, walking the polished floor with careful, deliberate steps, it is always a small thing at first, but small things often tell the largest stories. By mid-morning, Flaxborough had begun to hum with its usual blend of curiosity and conjecture, but the atmosphere carried a peculiar, almost imperceptible charge ever since the flower show's raffle had concluded. In the post office, the barber shop, and the slightly cramped confines of the Swan's Tear tea-room, the tale of Mrs. Pargeter's fortuitous or suspicious win was told and retold with ever more colourful embellishments. At the post office, Mr. Jupp, the senior clerk, cleared his throat, preparing to recount the episode for the benefit of Mrs. Filch, who came in precisely twice a week to collect letters and to deliver gossip. "So it was," he began with the ceremonial gravity of one revealing a state secret, "that the widow drew her own ticket. Not a trick of the eye, mind you. Her own. Right there." He waved a hand for emphasis, nearly tipping a stack of parcels, and Mrs. Filch leaned forward, her spectacles sliding down the bridge of her nose. "Did she know?" she asked, her voice just above a whisper, as if the mere suggestion might summon scandal itself. "No," Mr. Jupp repeated, frowning. "I dare say she did. Why else would she?" His voice tapered off as Mrs. Filch nodded sagely, inserting her own conjecture. Meanwhile, across the square, the barber shop was no less animated. Mr. Smalley, who usually limited his observations to the cut of one's hair and the occasional small-town rumor, declared with sudden authority, "I've known that widow for a mere fortnight, and already she's up to something. Only a matter of time before the whole town's in a flap. You mark my words." The customers, caught between a shiver of excitement and a desire to appear suitably indifferent, murmured their assent. One or two, especially those who had witnessed Mrs. Pargeter's almost imperceptible glance at the ticket before drawing it, felt a sudden chill, as though they were complicit in some unspoken trickery. It was in the Swan's Tear that the matter reached its most refined form. Here, under the influence of slightly oversteeped tea and the soft whisper of simmering gossip, local ladies dissected the incident with surgical precision. "I saw it," said Mrs. Trelawney, sweeping a strand of hair from her forehead, the way she paused, and then smiled ever so slightly. She may be a widow, but she is not lacking in cunning. Her companion, Mrs. Havisham, leaned in, lowering her voice even as they sipped on the bitter liquid. Perhaps she did it deliberately. Perhaps it was merely the luck of a well-shuffled basket. But mark my words, if it is the former, Flaxborough will never be the same. The discussion soon branched out to include everyone and everything connected to Mrs. Pargeter's past. Nottinghamshire intrigues, hints of genteel bankruptcy, a supposed duel with a rival cousin over lace patterns, and an ill-fated attempt at a garden club championship. Each fact was embroidered, the threads of speculation weaving into an increasingly complex tapestry. By the time lunch approached, it was no longer clear whether the widow Pargeter had won the raffle, or whether she had orchestrated an elaborate and audacious scheme to claim the teapot. Inspector Purbright, however, remained curiously detached. He had spent the morning observing without speaking, taking careful note of the reactions of those around him. Mr. Crabbe's muttering had not gone unnoticed, nor had the slight stiffening of Mrs. Trelawney's back as she recounted the event to Mrs. Filch. It was, he considered, precisely the combination of restraint and overstatement that revealed the underlying currents of Flaxborough's civic life. Small indignities, petty rivalries, minor acts of pride are all elements of a social choreography that could, when considered carefully, illuminate human motives more reliably than any forensic analysis. By the afternoon, the town had divided itself, unofficially, into factions. There were those who defended the widow on grounds of innocent fortune, insisting that one could not suspect a lady of her apparent refinement. Then there were those who quietly seethed with envy, ready to interpret every polite word or smile as a confirmation of some clandestine design. And finally, there were the truly pragmatic, who cared little for social proprieties and more for the amusement that the incident had provided. At the Flaxborough Arms, the atmosphere was different yet again. The landlord, Mr. Aldridge, had placed a small notice on the bar reading, "Teapot winner, Mrs. Pargeter, come and hear the tale," and the men who congregated there drank their pints with the added zest of mild scandal. Here, the story became animated with speculation about the widow's character, whether she had ever been seen in Nottinghamshire gambling houses, whether she possessed a shrewd mind or merely a silver tongue, whether her tea-making skills could plausibly justify a teapot prize. Each pint was punctuated with laughter, and the occasional more serious nod of approval at the logic applied or misapplied in her supposed manipulation. Purbright, strolling past on his routine afternoon inspection of civic calm, noted the way the men's eyes flickered when they thought no one else could see. He paused politely at the edge of the room. "I see the teapot has generated some local enthusiasm," he remarked, his tone as mild as a summer breeze, though it carried a faint edge of authority. Mr. Aldridge grinned, polishing a glass. "Aye, Inspector. Enthusiasm, scandal, a bit of both, I'd say. Makes a change from the usual talk of the market price of cabbages or when the gasworks will get fixed." "Indeed," Purbright replied, glancing at the assembled men, noting their hesitations, the way one or two cleared their throats before speaking, the manner in which eyes briefly avoided meeting his own. Small, almost imperceptible clues, yet he registered them all. For every man who spoke too quickly, there was another whose silence spoke volumes. By early evening, the whispers had migrated back to private homes. In the Pargeter household, Mrs. Pargeter herself busied herself with preparing tea and biscuits for her occasional caller, Mrs. Havisham. She bore the gossip with serene poise, as though it were a natural consequence of residing in a market town. "The teapot," she remarked quietly, "is entirely suitable for a lady of my age, and I find that fortune, like a gentle breeze, tends to arrive unannounced. One does not always grasp it fully, yet one must respect it." Her tone was polite, precise, and carried just a hint of irony that suggested she was entirely aware of the attention her Raffle win had provoked. Meanwhile, in a neighboring street, Mrs. Trelawney composed herself for a more formal intervention, a letter to the Society Committee in which she carefully detailed what she perceived as irregularities in the Raffle proceedings. Her penmanship was impeccable, her rhetoric deliberately severe yet still cloaked in the appropriate niceties of civility. "It is not so much that I suspect impropriety," she wrote, "as that prudence dictates inquiry." And so the town settled into its usual rhythm, albeit with the undercurrent of a subtle, unresolved tension. The newspapers of the region might never have taken notice, yet in Flaxborough, where everyone knew everyone else's habits, half-truths were accepted as a social currency, and small incidents could ripple into substantial unease. The teapot had done more than its immediate function. It had, as Purbright mused later while examining the modest dust of his office desk, become a lens through which the true character of the town and its inhabitants might be observed. The day closed with Mrs. Pargeter smiling politely at her own reflection in the parlor mirror, unaware of which whispers would follow her to the next meeting, which suspicions would linger, and which small affronts would eventually reveal themselves in the form of quiet, almost imperceptible deeds. And Purbright, as always, noted that these minor tremors, when carefully catalogued, would inevitably guide him toward truths hidden beneath the surface, truths that were always more human and more instructive than any purely criminal motive. By the time the street lamps flickered on, casting the market square in a gentle, golden glow, the stage had been set for the next move, not by the police, not by obvious suspicion, but by the gentle, almost imperceptible shifts of social order that only a town like Flaxborough could produce. Inspector Purbright arrived at the town hall the following morning with the sort of deliberate punctuality that allowed him to observe without intrusion. The hall, still faintly scented of yesterday's flowers and polish, was quiet save for the echoes of a broom against the wooden floor. He made his way toward the committee room, noting the small details that had eluded casual notice the day before. A faint smudge on the edge of the raffle basket, the subtle tilt of a chair near the refreshments table, and the way a stray petal from Mrs. Trelawney's roses had come to rest in the corner of the stage. His first call was on Mrs. Trelawney herself, seated stiffly at her usual committee table with a clipboard balanced precariously on her lap. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, her tone polite but tinged with impatience. "I suppose you're here to ask about the teapot." "Indeed," Purbright replied, settling himself in the chair opposite her with measured grace. "I'm curious about the arrangements, particularly the drawing of the winning ticket." He allowed a slight pause, observing her reaction. Mrs. Trelawney's hand tightened around her pen. The procedure was perfectly standard, Inspector. The tickets were thoroughly shuffled in the wicker basket, which was examined by both the committee and the observers. I failed to see where suspicion could reasonably arise. Her eyes, however, betrayed a flicker of something that suggested a memory she had chosen not to articulate. And yet, Purbright said gently, "You mentioned yesterday that prudence dictated inquiry." Mrs. Trelawney's lips compressed. "Well, prudence, yes. One cannot be too careful in such matters. The town is susceptible to rumor. The committee wishes merely to avoid any appearance of impropriety." Purbright inclined his head. The statement was entirely conventional, yet it hinted at the subtle anxieties running beneath Flaxborough's social surface. He made a note to observe her interactions with the committee members later in the week. Next, he called on Mr. Percy Crabb, who ran a small seed and fertilizer shop on Market Lane and had made no secret of his irritation over the flower show's results. Crabb welcomed Purbright with a frown and a sweep of his hand toward the neatly arranged seed packets. "Inspector, I'm at a loss," he said, pacing between rows of flower catalogues. It was impossible that Mrs. Pargeter won fairly. Not that she isn't. Charming enough, but a teapot like that, drawn by her own hand, preposterous. I've never known anyone in this town to have the cheek to claim her own luck. Purbright observed the rapidity with which Crabb moved from one seed rack to another, the slight tremor in his voice when he mentioned the widow. "And you suspect that she acted deliberately?" he asked softly. Crabb's frown deepened. "I would not wish to accuse a lady, Inspector, but she seems to. Calculating. One notices such things over time. A pause here, a glance there. Small cues, and yet perhaps I am merely a victim of misperception." He shrugged, though his hands continued to fidget with seed packets as though that alone could resolve his inner conflict. The inspector's next visit was to the committee chairman, Mr. Leighton Smythe, who had a reputation for being conciliatory, if not particularly decisive. Leighton Smythe received Purbright in his office, papers neatly stacked, spectacles perched halfway down his nose. "Inspector, we have reviewed the proceedings," he said. "Everything was, as they say, above board. But the town, well, you know the town. It is restless." "Restless?" Purbright prompted, allowing his voice to remain neutral. "Yes," said Leighton Smythe. "Whispers of impropriety, though unfounded, are circulating. There is no proof, of course, but you understand how these things propagate. One person sees a slight pause, another sees a smile. Soon enough, a story becomes something else entirely." Purbright nodded slowly. "And the raffle basket itself has any irregularities noted?" "None," Leighton Smythe assured him. "It is an ordinary wicker basket, tested, cleaned, ordinary. Yet, the perception remains, Inspector. That is what unsettles people." Leaving the chairman's office, Purbright took a measured stroll along Market Lane. The town's atmosphere was now perceptibly altered. Shopkeepers glanced up with faint concern. Children lingered near doorways, listening to snippets of adult conversation. The social fabric, ordinarily steady and unremarkable, had developed subtle ruffles, small creases of tension, each one whispering of human nature and quiet rivalry. He paused at the window of the Swan's Tear, noting Mrs. Havisham and another local lady engaged in what appeared to be a careful dissection of the widow's gestures the day before. They spoke in low tones, punctuating each sentence with decisive nods and tutting sounds. Purbright made a mental note. Observation of repeated, corroborated behaviors often yielded insight more reliable than immediate declarations. By mid-afternoon, he had visited nearly all principal figures in the flower show's organization, noting contradictions, hesitations, and the occasional excessive precision in recounting events. The widow Pargeter herself had remained almost entirely serene in these enquiries, her replies polite, measured, and unhurried. Yet Purbright noticed one small detail during their conversation that day. The widow's teacup, resting on a side table, had been moved just slightly closer to her by her maid, while she spoke a movement so subtle that only careful observation could have revealed it. He filed the note away, intuitively sensing it might later speak volumes. The inspector then took time to walk through the hall once more, alone, pausing by the spot where Mrs. Pargeter had drawn the ticket. The wicker basket lay empty, innocuous, but Purbright's mind catalogued the minor discrepancies he had observed. The slight smudge on the basket's rim, the pattern of glances exchanged between committee members, and, most importantly, the uniform calm with which the widow had accepted her prize. Each detail, mundane alone, began to assemble a larger, quiet narrative. By the end of the day, Purbright returned to his office, sat behind his desk, and began the familiar, patient process of mapping events and statements. He wrote down who had been present, who had reacted in what manner, and which small gestures seemed out of place. The town's social undercurrents were gradually revealing their patterns. Envy, pride, small satisfactions, and carefully contained grievances. None of these, individually, were unusual. Together, however, they began to form a lattice work through which the truth might be discerned, once the proper lines of questioning were applied. And as the evening deepened and the town's lamplights flickered on, casting the narrow streets in soft golden pools, Purbright reflected on what he had learned. That in Flaxborough, as in all human communities, the subtler clues, the slight hesitation, the faint smile, the almost invisible movement often carried the greatest weight. He understood now that the apparent simplicity of a raffle had introduced something far more intricate, a weave of human observation and perception that would require patience, discretion, and careful strategy to unravel. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself a faint smile. The widow Pargeter had, inadvertently or otherwise, set in motion a series of reactions that would occupy the town for days to come and, if he was cautious and attentive, offer him a rare glimpse of the subtle, unspoken truths that governed Flaxborough life. By the second day following the flower show, Flaxborough had fully adopted its customary posture of polite suspicion. In shops, parlors, and even the town's small library, the tale of Mrs. Pargeter's Raffle victory had taken on the subtle trappings of scandal. One name in particular seemed to hover at the center of conversation, although spoken with careful deference: Mr. Percy Crabbe. Crabbe, whose irritation had already been noted by Purbright, became the unofficial focus of the town's speculation, not because anyone suspected him of wrongdoing, but because his open dissatisfaction lent the incident a sharp edge. In truth, the committee and several of the more cautious townsfolk began to favor the notion that he might have engineered some minor manipulation to produce a controlled outcome. Crabbe, after all, had both motive and opportunity. He had been present throughout the drawing. He possessed the habitual meticulousness that made him notice trivial inconsistencies, and, according to several sources, he had expressed open envy of Mrs. Pargeter's calm comportment and conspicuous charm. Purbright, however, observed the burgeoning consensus with measured interest. In his office, he placed a careful note against Crabbe's name. Too eager to explain, too visible in discomfort, yet entirely transparent in actions. The record would serve him well when he needed to distinguish between theatrical guilt and genuine culpability. The inspector's first formal visit that morning was to the seed shop itself. Crabbe greeted him with an air of wounded propriety, as though the day's events had personally affronted his very character. "Inspector, I trust you will understand that I have done nothing improper," he said, his hands clasped behind his back as he circled the shop floor. "I merely voiced my opinion. One is allowed an opinion, is one not?" "Certainly," Purbright replied, his tone neutral, allowing the words to settle without comment. But I wonder, Mr. Crabbe, if one might also consider the effect of one's reactions on the town's perception. Sometimes the outward expression of concern appears as something else entirely. Crabbe's frown deepened. Do you imply, Inspector, that I have been misunderstood? Perhaps, Purbright said softly. Or perhaps you have been observed with a clarity you yourself did not anticipate. It is curious how even the smallest gestures may take on weight in the collective eye. Crabbe muttered something about exaggeration and returned to fussing with his seed packets, though his hands betrayed a nervous tension, twitching slightly when no one appeared to notice. Purbright recorded the subtle discrepancy, noting that the man's agitation was real, yet not necessarily indicative of deceit. Next, the inspector made his way to Mrs. Trelawney, who had convened a small committee meeting to discuss her letter to the society. The room smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood, and the attendees, Mrs. Havisham, Miss Penrose, and a few others, sat with upright posture, each acutely aware of the underlying tension. Inspector, Mrs. Trelawney began, her voice a combination of indignation and civility, we are simply concerned that Flaxborough's reputation be preserved. The Raffle, while perhaps innocent in intention, has raised questions that must be addressed. And I do think Mr. Crabbe's conduct during the drawing warrants some consideration. Purbright noted the careful phrasing. She implied suspicion without ever asserting it directly. I see, he said. You consider the possibility that his irritation might have influenced events? Not influenced by events, Mrs. Trelawney corrected sharply. But perhaps he observed and acted upon an opportunity unintentionally or otherwise. One must be vigilant, Inspector. One cannot dismiss the small, calculated actions of an individual, even when their purpose is unclear. It was clear that the committee's consensus was forming around Crabbe, who, in his own meticulous way, had already become the first obvious suspect. Yet, as Purbright had long learned, the most apparent individual was rarely the source of a quiet, intricate disturbance. Human behavior, after all, seldom adhered to tidy lines of cause and effect, particularly in a town such as Flaxborough. The afternoon was spent visiting secondary witnesses, Mr. Leighton Smythe, who remained diplomatically neutral, Mrs. Havisham, who relished the nuances of social observation, and even Miss Penrose, the librarian whose acute awareness of human temperament allowed her to offer insights in a whisper, each phrase measured to avoid accusation, but loaded with implication. All remarks, when gathered together, painted a picture of Crabbe as anxious, envious, and outwardly restless, yet devoid of direct action beyond mere observation. Purbright's thoughts wandered back to the widow Pargeter. She had remained largely unaffected by the circulating speculation, maintaining a calm composure that contrasted sharply with the nervous gestures of Crabbe and the anxious politeness of Mrs. Trelawney. There was a subtle intelligence in her manner, a capacity to occupy social space without exerting undue influence, that suggested she was fully aware of how her Raffle victory had destabilized the town's equilibrium. Later, Purbright observed the widow at the Swan's Tear, seated near a window and sipping tea with the patience of someone accustomed to careful social observation. A young girl delivering a note tripped slightly, and Mrs. Pargeter's hand moved instinctively to steady the paper. The gesture was minor, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a grace and attention that bespoke her habitual vigilance over small details. Purbright noted the moment in his mind, cataloguing it alongside other seemingly trivial occurrences. A careful smile, a subtle glance, the repositioning of a teacup, all small, deliberate acts that might, collectively, explain the reactions of the town. By evening, the consensus around Crabbe had solidified in polite conversation. He was the likely origin of any perceived irregularities, though no one could cite an actual breach. And yet, Purbright remained deliberately silent, aware that the apparent clarity of suspicion was itself a useful device, drawing attention away from the more delicate subtleties he had begun to discern. He returned to his office, considering the day's observations. The outward nervousness of Crabbe, the careful indignation of Mrs. Trelawney, and the serene awareness of Mrs. Pargeter all pointed to one inescapable truth. The obvious suspect rarely bore the full weight of responsibility in Flaxborough, and the minor anomalies he had noted, the movement of a teacup, a glance held just a fraction too long, the faint smudge on the raffle basket would, if properly correlated, reveal the actual mechanism behind the social disturbance. Purbright made careful notes, arranging each observation in chronological and behavioral order. His mind worked quietly, linking gestures to motive, expression to intent, and social habit to opportunity. And as the night deepened, he allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The first suspect was known to all. The real solution remained concealed, quietly gathering strength in the unremarkable patterns of human behavior he had so assiduously recorded. Tomorrow he would begin the next phase of inquiry, testing reactions, introducing subtle prompts, and observing the town's response to small, controlled interventions. The widow, he suspected, was far more adept at navigating Flaxborough's intricate social currents than anyone had yet acknowledged, and it would take all of Purbright's patience, insight, and unobtrusive strategy to determine whether her calm composure was merely elegance or the quiet engine of a deeper, unseen intention. By mid-morning, the town of Flaxborough had settled into a routine that carried a faint hum of tension beneath its usual rhythm. The flower show's teapot incident had become the quiet centerpiece of conversation, and Purbright found himself walking the familiar streets with a sense of deliberate anticipation. He was not yet ready to confront anyone directly. Instead, he preferred the patient method of observation, allowing events to reveal themselves in their natural cadence. It was in the small alley behind the town hall that he first noticed the anomaly. A slip of paper, delicate and slightly creased, had lodged itself beneath the boot of the hall's delivery cart. Purbright bent, retrieved it, and examined it carefully. The note was an innocuous scrap, containing a brief reminder about committee meeting times and floral arrangements. Yet something about the handwriting struck him. A slight tremor in the lines, a flourish that seemed at odds with the precision Mrs. Trelawney typically applied to her correspondence. He pocketed the scrap, filing it mentally for comparison with later samples. From there, his path led to the Swan's Tear, where Mrs. Havisham had gathered several acquaintances to discuss, with whispering seriousness, the implications of the widow's Raffle success. Purbright paused at the doorway, listening unobtrusively. The conversation was dominated by conjecture regarding Mr. Crabbe's obvious agitation and Mrs. Pargeter's serene demeanor. Yet amid the speculation, a small remark caught his attention. The mention that during the raffle, someone unnamed had shifted the basket slightly just before the winning ticket was drawn. Curious, Purbright returned to the hall, inspecting the area where the basket had rested. The floor bore faint scuff marks, barely perceptible but telling under careful scrutiny. The marks indicated a small adjustment, perhaps a step backward or sideways, timed with the drawing. He smiled inwardly, a trivial detail, yet one capable of elucidating far more than any of the loud accusations that had followed. The question now was, who had made the movement and why? His next call was upon the hall's caretaker, Mr. Sprott, a man of retiring nature who preferred a quiet life but had an eye for minutiae. "Did you notice anything unusual when the raffle ticket was drawn?" Purbright asked politely. Sprott adjusted his spectacles. "Well, Inspector, there was a slight movement, yes. A shuffle of feet, I think. I didn't think much of it at the time. People shift now and then. But now you mention it." He trailed off, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "It was subtle, barely perceptible, but I recall a shadow of motion near the basket, just before Mrs. Pargeter drew the ticket." Purbright nodded, noting the phrasing carefully. "A shadow of motion," he repeated softly. "And did anyone else appear near the basket at that moment?" Sprott hesitated. Not exactly. But the committee was gathered on one side, the public on the other. And I remember thinking that Mrs. Pargeter's hand paused over the ticket slightly longer than it should have. The inspector's interest sharpened. Two subtle anomalies, a slight shuffle of the basket, and a pause in the widow's movement. Alone, each might have seemed trivial. Together, they suggested a sequence of carefully orchestrated gestures, almost imperceptible to casual observation, but not beyond the discerning eye of someone attuned to human behavior. Next, Purbright visited Mrs. Pargeter herself, now accustomed to minor inquiries, received her in her drawing room, the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. "Inspector," she said, smiling politely, "I trust your inquiries have been untroubling?" "Not at all, Mrs. Pargeter," Purbright replied, settling into a chair. "In fact, I am merely curious about one small aspect of the raffle. I understand that you paused momentarily before selecting the winning ticket." Her eyes lifted slightly, as though considering how much to reveal. "A pause?" "Perhaps," she said carefully. "One always surveys the situation before making a choice. I believe in consideration, Inspector. It is a habit, cultivated over many years." "Indeed," Purbright murmured, observing her hands resting lightly on the teacup at her side. "And the basket itself, was it exactly where you intended, or did it require a small adjustment?" Mrs. Pargeter inclined her head, acknowledging the observation with gentle civility. "It was entirely as I found it, though naturally one ensures the object of attention is suitably positioned before acting. I'm not one to grasp a prize blindly." She allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to form, as though the simplicity of her explanation masked a more complex awareness. Purbright left her house with a growing sense of anticipation. The trivialities, scuff marks, pauses, slight adjustments formed a lattice of cause and effect that would only fully reveal itself once the right threads were tugged. Each minor detail, unnoticed by the majority, would serve as a crucial guide in understanding the social mechanics behind the raffle. Returning to his office, he laid out his notes, the scuff mark, the tremulous note, the fleeting pause, the slight shift of the basket, and the widow's serene composure. Each observation, minor in isolation, now began to interconnect, suggesting a pattern, a deliberate orchestration of human attention, subtle enough to be overlooked, yet precise enough to manipulate perception. By evening, Purbright had reconnoitered the town streets once more, watching the interactions between townspeople with patient scrutiny. Shopkeepers exchanged quiet looks over counters, neighbors murmured behind curtains, and the young messenger boys darted through the market square, bearing snippets of speculation. Everywhere, the small social ripple created by the raffle subtly altered behavior. People smiled with care, gestured with caution, and occasionally paused mid-step, as though unconsciously echoing the widow's measured gestures from the day before. He paused at the edge of the square, noting a slight breeze moving petals from a nearby flower stall. It was an innocuous sight, yet for Purbright, it mirrored the unfolding dynamic of the town itself. Minor movements, easily overlooked, could subtly shape events, guiding actions and reactions with the precision of a hand unseen. And as he returned to his desk that night, cataloguing each minor anomaly and quietly reflecting upon their significance, he realized that the trivial oddity, the shuffle of the basket, the pause in the hand, the faint tremor of ink on a note would soon point the investigation toward truths far more delicate and human than the town's initial assumptions suggested. The town had already named its suspect, yet the real mechanism of perception, manipulation, and social subtlety had only just begun to reveal itself. In Flaxborough, as always, the smallest things were often the most telling, and the most innocuous gestures were frequently the ones that spoke loudest of intent. By midweek, The quiet perturbation caused by the flower show's raffle had begun to radiate outward, touching nearly every corner of Flaxborough's social landscape. The small town, ordinarily governed by predictable routines, now hummed with tentative curiosity, subtle envy, and the occasional carefully disguised intrigue. Purbright, as always, took his observations slowly, letting the patterns emerge rather than forcing them. His first visit that morning was to the bakery on Market Lane, where Mr. Swithin, the proprietor, arranged his pastries with a precision rivaling any horticultural display. Swithin, a man normally concerned only with the even spacing of eclairs and the proper sheen on croissants, had been quietly swept up by the town's gossip currents. "Inspector, I couldn't help but overhear," he began, polishing the counter with obsessive care, "that the widow's teapot business has unsettled people. Not that I wish to speculate, of course, but one does notice oddities. For instance, Mr. Crabbe fumed something terrible when he saw her winning. But others seem even more precise in their movements, almost as if observing an experiment." Purbright nodded slightly, noting both Swithin's words and the way his hands trembled just enough to suggest genuine curiosity rather than idle chatter. There was truth in the observation. The social field was no longer confined to the flower show committee. It had spread to the town's everyday interactions, altering behaviors subtly yet perceptibly. From the bakery, Purbright wandered along the cobbled square, noting faces and gestures with his customary patience. Children paused mid-run to whisper observations to one another. Shopkeepers adjusted their displays slightly, not from practical need, but in a barely conscious effort to maintain appearances. At the bookshop, Miss Penrose, ever alert to nuances of human behavior, shared a small observation in a low voice. "It is fascinating, Inspector," she said, "how even the most innocuous act, the movement of a teacup, a step to the left, a glance can ripple through the community. The town is responding to cues almost invisible to the untrained eye. The widow's presence seems to calibrate their reactions." Purbright filed the remark silently, aware that Miss Penrose's insight, delivered as casual commentary, was often more reliable than overt testimony. He made a note to observe the interactions in the square at varying times of day, suspecting that the town itself was now a participant in an unspoken social experiment. By noon, he had turned his attention to the more domestic spheres of influence. He visited Mrs. Havisham, whose parlor had become a small nerve center for social analysis. Seated amid polished teacups and the faint scent of lavender, she enumerated the peculiarities she had noted. A sudden attentiveness among the town's older ladies when Mrs. Pargeter was present, a subtle tightening of lips among committee members, and a heightened awareness of minor gestures in otherwise unremarkable interactions. "The town is observing itself through her," Mrs. Havisham concluded, with a faint smile, "and none of them quite knows it." Purbright responded with mild amusement, yet in his notes he recorded the behavioral specifics she mentioned: the tilt of the head, the adjustment of gloves, the occasional pause mid-utterance. Every detail, he knew, was a thread in the tapestry of cause and effect, each revealing something of both the observer and the observed. His path next led him to the florist, Mrs. Pembroke, whose roses had been the subject of Mrs. Trelawney's keen scrutiny during the flower show. Mrs. Pembroke was not only meticulous about blooms, but also particularly sensitive to social nuance. She recounted a minor incident. While arranging her exhibits, she had noticed a faint exchange of glances between two committee members, one of whom had adjusted the raffle basket by a fraction of an inch. No one spoke, she explained, but it felt like a conversation entirely conveyed through posture and gesture. Curious, really, that the smallest movements carry such weight in this town. Purbright made a careful note of the details. The subtlety of intention behind otherwise innocuous gestures was precisely the sort of behavioral clue that might reveal the deeper mechanism behind the unfolding social drama. By mid-afternoon, he visited the railway buffet, where Mr. Lane, a mild-mannered station-master, observed the ripple effects of the raffle among the travelling public. Passengers, he noted, discussed the flower show with a mixture of amusement and gravity, each adding their interpretation to the circulating story. One young woman in particular remarked on Mrs. Pargeter's composure and the almost imperceptible choreography of her hands, as if every motion had been timed and weighted for effect. Mr. Lane, a man more accustomed to schedules than subtlety, nevertheless acknowledged the precision of observation. Purbright's path then returned to the widow Pargeter herself. She welcomed him with her usual calm, the teacup poised delicately in her hand. He asked only trivial questions, yet watched closely for the slightest reaction to mention minor details, the movement of the basket, the timing of gestures, the reactions of townspeople. She responded with her customary poise, her eyes bright but unreadable, revealing nothing, and yet, somehow, hinting at a consciousness entirely aware of the effects of her presence. As the day waned, Purbright paused in the market square, observing clusters of citizens gathered in pairs and trios, whispering and gesturing with care. Small irritations surfaced, minor grievances, the pride of a meticulously tended garden, the envy of a well-polished teapot, but all were tempered by civility. Each interaction revealed a subtle hierarchy, a network of quiet ambitions, and the faint tremors of social anxiety stirred by a single, apparently trivial event. In his office that evening, Purbright catalogued the day's observations with methodical care. Every glance, every paused gesture, every faint adjustment of a teacup or chair was entered into his mental ledger. The town, in its collective attention to Mrs. Pargeter, had unwittingly revealed patterns of behavior and social dynamics that might otherwise have remained hidden. He realized that while the outward focus rested on Mr. Crabbe and the committee, the more telling truths lay in the subtle interplay between observation and action, each minor detail amplifying the effects of the seemingly ordinary. Purbright leaned back in his chair, considering the lattice of human behavior he had now assembled. The trivialities, the scuff marks, the adjusted basket, the fleeting glances, the careful pauses were not meaningless. They formed a code, a quiet choreography that only someone patient and attentive could decipher. And he knew, with the certainty born of experience, that these small, seemingly inconsequential details would, when interpreted correctly, reveal not only the mechanism behind the raffle, but the characters of those involved and the intricate, almost imperceptible ways in which Flaxborough's social order had been momentarily, delicately, disrupted. It was a damp Thursday morning when Flaxborough found itself startled anew. The second incident, quiet yet disconcerting, occurred not in the hall of the flower show or among the gossiping ladies of the tea-room, but in the unassuming precincts of the town library. Miss Penrose, the librarian, discovered that several catalogued books volumes of local history and horticultural reference had been rearranged overnight, their order slightly altered, though no pages were missing or damaged. At first glance, the shift seemed negligible, yet for the attentive observer, it was the sort of detail that spoke of deliberate action. Someone had been there, unnoticed, manipulating the order with care and subtlety. News spread quickly through the town, carried by the familiar whispers of Market Lane and the Swan's Tear alike. By mid-morning, the Flaxborough Arms was abuzz. Patrons leaned over pints to discuss who might have meddled with the library's catalogue. Some blamed idle children, others the vaguely suspect Mr. Crabbe, whose earlier agitation had made him a convenient scapegoat. "It's him, I tell you," said Mr. Aldridge, polishing a glass with vigorous insistence. "No one else fusses over order like he does." Purbright arrived at the library with the deliberate calm that had become his hallmark. The room smelled faintly of paper, dust, and polish. The air was heavy with quiet anticipation. Miss Penrose met him at the door, her expression a mixture of mild indignation and fascination. "Inspector, I confess, it is disturbing," she said. "The books are in a slightly different order. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged, but precise. Almost as if someone wished me to notice." "Precisely," Purbright agreed, glancing at the neat rows of volumes. He noted the subtle shift. A book of Victorian gardening had been moved one slot to the right, a local history text slightly forward, its spine aligning differently with the others. The changes were imperceptible to casual observation, but deliberate in execution. "Have you any idea who might have done this?" he asked, carefully observing her posture and tone. Miss Penrose shook her head. "It is so small, Inspector. A trifle, almost. But given the events of the flower show, one cannot help but wonder if it is connected. Someone testing attention, perhaps. Or dare I say a subtle statement about order, precision, and perception." Purbright made a note, cataloguing both the alterations and her interpretation. The library, it seemed, had become a stage for subtle communication, echoing the tiny gestures and movements that had dominated the earlier Raffle. Investigation. His next visit was to Mr. Crabbe, who, unsurprisingly, bristled at the suggestion that he could be implicated in the new disturbance. "Inspector," he began, pacing the length of his seed shop, "I'm at my wit's end. First the teapot, now the books. That is all. Unsettling. I did nothing, I assure you. But the town's mind runs wild. My every twitch, every movement is taken as proof of some hidden plot. It is maddening." Purbright listened quietly, noting not only Crabbe's words, but the subtle agitation in his hands and the repeated adjustment of his spectacles. He recorded the signs of anxiety, which suggested culpability and perception rather than action. By noon, the town's chatter had evolved to include speculation about motive. Had the rearrangement been a playful comment on Crabbe's obsession with order? A deliberate jest aimed at Mrs. Trelawney, whose meticulousness had been noted during the flower show? Or, most intriguingly, the subtle demonstration of the widow's capacity to influence, without overt action, the behaviors and perceptions of those around her? Purbright, moving quietly through Market Lane, observed the reactions of townspeople as they discussed the incident. Shopkeepers lowered voices while describing the crime. Children whispered conspiratorially, and even the post office clerk allowed a faint smile to escape when recounting the minor disruption. Each reaction was a small window into the town's psyche, revealing how social expectation, envy, and admiration interwove. Later, he returned to the widow Pargeter, who received him with her usual calm, the teacup poised precisely as the morning sun filtered through lace curtains. "Inspector," she said, "I trust you have not been troubled by the library's little rearrangement." "I was merely observing, Mrs. Pargeter," Purbright replied, "and yet the alterations are subtle, precise, almost thoughtful. One might wonder if they are meant to be noticed or merely to influence the perceptions of those who observe." She smiled faintly. "One never knows how small acts may ripple, Inspector. Even a minor adjustment, a slight shift, can evoke attention or understanding or occasionally a reaction entirely unanticipated. But I would not presume to interfere with the town's affairs." Her composure was perfect, almost serene, yet Purbright detected a flicker of amusement in her eyes, as though the conversation itself were a small, private game. By afternoon, Purbright expanded his inquiries to the committee and the library staff, noting a variety of reactions. Some were overtly irritated. Others, like Miss Penrose, were intrigued by the precision of the alterations. Among these reactions, he observed one particularly interesting pattern: the subtle gestures, pauses, and glances that mirrored the minor discrepancies of the flower show Raffle. The town's social fabric had become an instrument through which a careful observer could read intent, if one only knew how to watch. At the railway buffet later, he overheard two travelers discuss the library incident in low voices. "It's as though the town itself is a stage," one remarked. "Every gesture, every small movement seems loaded with meaning." Purbright noted the statement, not for its novelty but for its reflection of the perception he himself was cultivating, that human behavior, especially in a small town, offered its own clues, often in lieu of concrete evidence. By evening, the library incident had caused a subtle realignment of social suspicion. Mr. Crabbe, once the focal point of communal attention, now seemed increasingly peripheral. The focus shifted imperceptibly to the widow herself, whose serene composure and calculated grace rendered her a more intriguing subject than the anxious seed merchant. Purbright, cataloguing the day's observations back at his office, realized the significance of the second incident. It was not merely a disruption, but a refinement, a reinforcement of the subtle interplay of perception, action, and social influence. The town's attention, initially directed at obvious suspects, had now been gently redirected, revealing layers of human behavior that had been overlooked in the excitement of the raffle. As night fell and the streets quieted, Purbright reflected upon the patterns emerging from the minor disturbances. The trivial yet deliberate adjustments, the pause of a hand, the subtle shift of a basket, the careful rearrangement of books were all part of a continuous, delicate choreography, and he understood that the next stage of his inquiry would require even greater subtlety. A test, a prompt, or a gentle provocation designed to reveal not just observation, but intention. In Flaxborough, as ever, the most telling truths would be whispered in gestures, noted in pauses, and recorded in the seemingly trivial details that most overlooked. That evening, after the town had settled into its habitual quiet, Inspector Purbright sat at his desk by the softly glowing lamp, the streets outside dimly lit by the amber glow of gas lights. The day's events, the subtle shift of the library books, the ripple of reactions in Market Lane, the silent scrutiny of shopkeepers and patrons played through his mind with deliberate slowness. He made no attempt to force conclusions. Instead, he allowed the patterns of human behavior to settle in his thoughts like sediment in a quiet pool. He considered Mr. Crabbe first. The man's agitation, previously so conspicuous, now appeared more as a reaction than an instigation. His fussing with seed packets, the repeated adjustment of spectacles, the visible frustration at the community's focus on the raffle, all were consistent with someone entirely innocent of actual manipulation, yet deeply affected by perception. Crabbe's outward display of anxiety, Purbright noted, had made him the town's first convenient suspect, and in turn had served as an excellent diversion from subtler dynamics unfolding elsewhere. Then there was Mrs. Trelawney, whose insistence on propriety had occasionally veiled a sharper sense of awareness. She had been diligent in observing both the proceedings of the flower show and the reactions of the townspeople, but she lacked the quiet omniscience that came from truly understanding the subtle choreography of attention. Her indignation was real but conventional. She sought reassurance through procedural correctness, whereas the real currents of influence moved almost imperceptibly around her. Purbright's thoughts returned to the widow Pargeter, her calm composure, her deliberate gestures, the small adjustments of teacup and basket, the faint smile that hinted at amusement, all suggested a consciousness fully aware of the town's observant eyes. She did not overtly act, yet the cumulative effect of her presence altered behavior in the marketplace, the tea-room, and even the library. It was a demonstration not of malice, but of subtle orchestration. She was a conductor of human perception, guiding attention with a deftness almost imperceptible. He considered the scuff marks on the floor by the raffle basket, the slight shuffle of the librarian's books, the small pause of a hand over a winning ticket, and realized these were not isolated anomalies. Each minor detail, trivial to the unobservant eye, had created a cascade of reactions. Suspicion, curiosity, anxiety, and admiration, all carefully balanced. The town's collective behavior had shifted as a result, and while some individuals had been quick to assign blame, the truth was far more intricate. Purbright's attention turned to the broader implications of these patterns. Flaxborough, he mused, was a town accustomed to routines, to polite conversation, and to the illusion of civility. Yet beneath the surface, the small actions of a few individuals had the capacity to reorder perception, revealing the quiet power of influence in social dynamics. The widow, by her conduct, had subtly reshaped the focus of attention without a single overt act of manipulation. It was a quiet lesson in human behavior, that even in a community governed by rules and norms, subtlety often triumphed over force. He reflected upon the interplay of envy and admiration that had characterized the responses of Mr. Crabbe, Mrs. Trelawney, and others. Each had reacted according to their temperament and expectations, yet none had truly discerned the mechanism by which the town's attention had been redirected. Only careful observation, combined with patience and the willingness to consider motive in the realm of subtle influence rather than overt action, could reveal the full picture. Purbright found himself smiling faintly, appreciating the elegance of the situation. There was no need for confrontation, no evidence to produce in the conventional sense. The clues were behavioral, almost imperceptible. A pause, a glance, a shift in posture, a slight tremor in ink. These, assembled with care and understood in context, were far more telling than any confession or physical evidence. He reviewed his notes in order: the initial shuffle of the raffle basket, the deliberate pause of Mrs. Pargeter's hand, the tremulous scrap of paper behind the town hall, the subtle rearrangement of library books, and the various small reactions of townspeople observed in Market Lane, the Swan's Tear, and the railway buffet. Together, they formed a lattice, a web of causation connecting intention, perception, and reaction. Purbright contemplated the next phase of his investigation. A subtle test, a carefully constructed situation to observe response without provocation, would likely elicit confirmation of his suspicions. He did not need to accuse or confront directly. Rather, he would introduce a small prompt, polite and non-threatening, and watch the widow's reaction. Human nature, he knew, could rarely resist responding when cues aligned with perception and habit. He allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The town had provided the clues. Its residents, in their reactions, had unwittingly illuminated the mechanisms at work. The obvious suspect, Crabbe, remained a convenient diversion. The subtle manipulations of social attention pointed elsewhere. All that remained was to craft the appropriate observation, the gentle test that would reveal not only the character but the strategy behind the town's recent disruptions. Finally, Purbright considered the human element, the interplay of small town politics, social pride, envy, and admiration. Each individual had acted according to temperament, social position, and expectation. And yet the truth, carefully observed and catalogued, existed quietly beneath the surface. In the small gestures, the minute deviations from routine and the faint adjustments of attention, the full story waited to be uncovered. He closed his notebook, extinguished the lamp, and allowed the soft silence of the office to settle. Tomorrow, he reflected, he would enact his test. A remark here, a subtle observation there, and the widow's response would reveal the final pieces of the puzzle. Flaxborough's intricate dance of civility, curiosity, and subtle rivalry would provide him all he needed if he watched closely, with patience, and, as always, without a trace of hurry. In the quiet of his office, Purbright understood that the solution lay not in accusation, but in the orchestration of opportunity. The town had done most of the work for him, revealing character, perception, and influence. The final steps would require only the gentle application of his experience, a question, a remark, or a moment designed to draw forth the truth, leaving the widow herself to confirm in her own subtle manner the conclusions already suggested by her actions and the town's response. The morning was crisp and faintly overcast, the kind of day that lent itself to careful observation without drawing undue attention. Inspector Purbright arrived at the Swan's Tear shortly after the town had begun its daily bustle. He had spent the previous evening devising a test, subtle enough to remain inconspicuous, yet likely to reveal the truth of the recent disturbances. It was, in essence, a quiet exercise in social psychology, a gentle provocation designed to elicit a telling reaction. He seated himself in a corner near the widow's usual table and ordered a pot of tea. The room was filled with the soft murmur of conversation, the clinking of cups, and the occasional scrape of a chair. He allowed the widow to settle, as she always did, in her customary chair by the window, teacup poised delicately in hand. Her calm demeanor remained, yet Purbright noted a faint sharpening of attention in her eyes, as though she sensed the observer's intent. The test was simple in appearance. Purbright casually mentioned in conversation with Mrs. Havisham that he had noticed the slight movements of the raffle basket and the minor rearrangement of books in the library. He spoke in tones of polite wonder, as if musing aloud rather than suggesting suspicion. "It is remarkable how the smallest gestures can ripple through an entire community," he remarked. A shuffle of a basket, a pause of the hand, almost imperceptible, yet sufficient to stir curiosity. Mrs. Havisham nodded appreciatively, murmuring agreement. Purbright observed Mrs. Pargeter carefully. At first, she sipped her tea in the usual composed manner, but as the remark about the basket and the library reached her ears, the faintest flicker of recognition passed across her face, a subtle arching of the eyebrows, a momentary tightening of the lips. Nothing dramatic. No overt admission, but enough to indicate awareness. He continued, introducing another minor prompt. One wonders, of course, whether such actions are intentional or merely accidental. It is difficult to tell unless one observes with patience, attentiveness, and perhaps a touch of imagination. Mrs. Pargeter allowed a thin, almost imperceptible smile. She looked toward the window, then back to the inspector and said nothing, though the slight upturn of her lips suggested amusement or perhaps acknowledgement. Purbright, in turn, allowed the pause to linger, his gaze gentle but unwavering. He was testing, observing, cataloguing, not accusing, letting the natural human response emerge unforced. Across the room, other patrons continued their conversations, unaware of the subtle exchange. Yet Purbright detected minute signs of behavior. Mrs. Trelawney's attentive posture stiffened slightly when the basket was mentioned. Mr. Crabbe shifted in his chair, hands tightening around the handle of his teacup. The town itself seemed to respond to the discussion, each person's reaction forming a complex web of attention and social signaling. Finally, Purbright introduced the key element of his test. He casually remarked that he had observed a faint tremor in a scrap of paper found near the town hall, nothing incriminating, merely curious. He noted the widow's response with clinical precision. Her eyes flicked momentarily to the window ledge, where the morning sunlight had caught the edges of a note she had left earlier, and then back to the inspector. There was a subtle nod, imperceptible to any but the most careful observer, and the faintest arch of the brow, almost as if she were acknowledging, silently, that she had orchestrated the events without revealing herself overtly. Purbright allowed the conversation to drift naturally, speaking now of minor horticultural details, shared recipes, and the town's weather. The widow continued her usual composed gestures, teacup lifted delicately, hands steady, yet all the while, Purbright noted the recurrent, almost imperceptible responses to references to subtle movement, small adjustments, and minor disturbances. The test had succeeded. She acknowledged, silently, the accuracy of his observations and the subtle choreography she had, apparently effortlessly, orchestrated. By mid-afternoon, Purbright withdrew to a quiet corner to review his notes. The evidence, though behavioral rather than physical, was now sufficient to construct a full account of the incidents. The minor scuff of the basket, the slight adjustment of the books, the careful pauses and glances, all were consistent with the widow's deliberate, controlled influence over the town's perceptions. Crabbe's agitation had been real, but entirely reactive, while the town's other citizens had been subtly guided in their attention by the widow's unassuming gestures. He reflected upon the elegance of the method. A single, calm individual, acting within the bounds of civility, capable of redirecting suspicion and attention without overt interference. The key was her mastery of subtle cues, the almost invisible language of gesture, timing and perception. Purbright noted each movement and reaction in his mental ledger, confident that the patterns were complete, the truth verifiable, and the town's apparent disturbances fully explained. Returning once more to the widow, he allowed himself a moment of gentle conversation, speaking of books, flowers, and the town's minor oddities. She responded with her customary politeness, yet there was now a faint sparkle in her eyes, a recognition that her subtle orchestration had been observed, catalogued, and understood by one person who would not sensationalize or unduly dramatize the truth. Purbright left the Swan's Tear as evening descended, the streets dimming into familiar patterns of shadows and gaslight. His test had been quiet, unobtrusive, and effective. The behavioral cues had revealed the orchestration behind both incidents, and the puzzle pieces now fit together. The minor details, the town's reactions, the shifts in perception all traced directly to the widow's careful, intentional influence. By the time he returned to his office, he had already begun to formulate the manner in which he would present the resolution. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no public embarrassment. Instead, he would assemble the witnesses, lay out the observations, and allow the truth to emerge naturally in a calm and civil manner. The widow Pargeter, serene and composed, would hear the explanation and recognize the elegance of the method without ever feeling unduly accused. The test had revealed what the obvious suspects, the anxious committee, and the gossiping townsfolk had overlooked, that subtlety, patience, and the careful orchestration of perception often had more power than overt action. Purbright closed his notebook with a quiet satisfaction. The final act would be simple, polite, and conclusive. All that remained was the presentation of the meticulously gathered evidence and the calm, civil revelation of truth. The following morning, the town hall was quietly prepared for what Purbright described to Mrs. Havisham as a brief civic review of recent minor peculiarities. Chairs were arranged neatly in rows, the podium polished, and a small table with tea and biscuits placed to one side. Flaxborough's residents arrived in a trickle, curious yet unassuming, unaware that they were about to witness the conclusion of the subtle drama that had occupied the past week. Purbright took his place at the front, facing the assembled townspeople with his usual calm and unobtrusive posture. Mr. Crabbe fidgeted in the back row, glancing repeatedly at the teacup before him. Mrs. Trelawney adjusted her gloves and cleared her throat, while Miss Penrose, serene as ever, observed with a faint smile. The widow Pargeter entered quietly, her presence as composed and unassuming as it had been throughout, taking a seat near the window, hands folded neatly in her lap. "Ladies and gentlemen," Purbright began, his voice deliberate and measured, "we have recently been presented with a series of events which, at first glance, appeared disconcerting. A raffle with unexpected results, minor rearrangements in the library, and the general stir of curiosity that accompanies unusual happenings in a small town. All of these occurrences, while superficially disparate, have a common thread." He paused, letting the words settle, scanning the faces before him with calm attentiveness. He began with the obvious Mr. Crabbe's visible distress and reactions during the flower show. Mr. Crabbe, as we have observed, was quite agitated by the outcome of the raffle. His concern was genuine and reactive, and his conduct was entirely in line with a man unused to perceived disorder. There was no manipulation, no subterfuge, merely human response to attention and circumstance. A gentle murmur of agreement spread through the room. Crabbe himself looked relieved, though still tense, as Purbright continued, shifting focus to the more subtle evidence. He described the scuff marks beneath the raffle basket, the faint tremor noted in the scrap of paper behind the town hall, and the minor but deliberate alterations to the library's book arrangement. As he spoke, he observed each listener carefully, noting small expressions and gestures, their eyes reflecting comprehension, curiosity, or mild amusement. And yet, Purbright said, drawing the narrative together, while these minor irregularities have attracted attention, it is the subtle orchestration of human perception that truly explains the sequence of events. The person whose actions shape the town's awareness, without overt interference, is present here. He allowed a soft pause, looking toward the widow, who remained composed, her lips forming the faintest trace of a smile. He described, in understated terms, the precise manner in which gestures, pauses, and movements had guided attention. The slight shuffle of the raffle basket, the careful timing of hand movements, the deliberate but almost imperceptible adjustments of books in the library. He emphasized that each act had been conducted within the bounds of propriety and civility, yet with sufficient subtlety to redirect perception and influence reaction. The orchestration, Purbright continued, required not force or coercion, but keen awareness and gentle timing. The result was a remarkable illustration of how small, considered actions can alter the pattern of observation in a community, leading to reactions that may seem disproportionate, but are, in fact, responses to subtle cues. The assembled townspeople listened with varying degrees of comprehension and surprise. Mrs. Trelawney nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Crabbe's shoulders relaxed slightly, and Miss Penrose allowed a faint, satisfied smile to appear. The widow Pargeter, ever composed, inclined her head ever so slightly, acknowledging the inspector's observations without a trace of embarrassment or defensiveness. Purbright concluded gently, "It is, I think, a testament to the civility, attentiveness, and engagement of Flaxborough that these events have revealed not malice or mischief, but the remarkable influence of careful observation and subtlety. The incidents, minor though they may seem, have illustrated the town's interconnectedness, its capacity for perception, and the elegance with which one can navigate human behavior with civility and discretion." There was a quiet pause, during which the town absorbed the understated explanation. Then Mrs. Havisham allowed a small sigh of relief to escape. Mr. Crabbe's anxious glance softened into a faint smile, and a gentle ripple of amused acknowledgment passed through several other townspeople. The widow Pargeter, serene and composed, had not spoken, yet the tilt of her head and the calm sparkle in her eyes conveyed understanding and quiet pride in the subtlety of her influence. Purbright offered a polite nod. "I hope this brief review demonstrates that the truth, even in small matters, is often found in careful observation and patient reflection, rather than in haste or speculation. Let us all take comfort in the civility of our responses and the small joys of our town's peculiarities." The assembly dispersed gradually, the atmosphere calm and the residual tension of the previous days replaced by mild amusement and contemplative appreciation. The tea and biscuits were consumed in the usual polite manner, and conversation drifted naturally to horticultural observations, the library's catalogue, and the curious ripple effects of minor actions. Purbright remained for a moment, observing the orderly retreat of townspeople. The second incident, the subtle manipulations, the minor disturbances, all had been explained without drama, without accusation, yet with full recognition of the subtle intelligence at work. The widow Pargeter, once a figure of mild speculation and curiosity, now enjoyed a quiet acknowledgment of her careful orchestration. The town had gained a newfound appreciation for the subtleties of social influence. By late afternoon, the hall was empty save for Purbright and the gentle shadows cast by the lowering sun. The mystery, understated yet fully resolved, lay neatly catalogued in his mind. The minor clues, the small movements, and the careful orchestration of perception had combined to reveal a truth elegant in its simplicity and entirely consistent with human behavior. Flaxborough had quietly returned to routine, enriched by the demonstration that even the smallest acts can have measurable, meaningful effects. Purbright packed his notes with calm satisfaction, aware that the subtlety of his method and the civility of the reveal had preserved both dignity and order. There would be no scandal, no resentment, only a quiet, shared understanding of the delicate mechanisms of influence and perception in their town, and the acknowledgement that, occasionally, even the most ordinary events could reveal something extraordinary about human nature. The town of Flaxborough, having weathered the minor disruptions of the flower show raffle and the library rearrangements, gradually resumed its usual rhythm. Market Lane hummed with the predictable chatter of shopkeepers and patrons. The Swan's Tear served its tea with the same careful precision, and the soft murmur of local gossip resumed, now tempered by the gentle knowledge that the recent peculiarities had been understood, if not entirely invisible. Inspector Purbright, arriving at his office in the late morning, found the air quiet, the day unremarkable except for the faint residual warmth of a mild spring sun filtering through the window. He laid aside the notes and observations meticulously compiled over the preceding days, reflecting with a subtle satisfaction on the calm resolution of the events. In a town accustomed to the ordinary, the extraordinary had manifested in the most delicate of ways, and yet it had been handled with civility, wit, and discretion. He made a brief visit to the widow Pargeter's residence, finding her in the drawing-room, arranging flowers with a measured care that seemed to echo the poise of her social orchestration. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I trust all is settled to your satisfaction." "Indeed, Mrs. Pargeter," Purbright replied with gentle formality. "Your conduct, as always, was exemplary. I believe the town has now absorbed the lesson of subtle influence and observation, and the minor disturbances may be left to the realm of anecdote rather than speculation." She smiled faintly, a hint of amusement in the careful tilt of her head, acknowledging both the inspector's assessment and the town's unknowing complicity in her quiet orchestration. There was no need for further words. Her composure alone conveyed understanding, a tacit recognition that the truth had been observed and appreciated. Purbright walked through the streets, noting the subtle shifts now settled into habit. Mr. Crabbe, relieved of undue suspicion, had returned to his seed shop, arranging packets with the precision of a man reassured in his innocence. Mrs. Trelawney, reflecting on minor imperfections in her garden, moved with renewed composure, having absorbed the civil explanation without rancor. Even the library, once a site of delicate disorder, resumed its familiar quiet, the books aligned as if the minor rearrangements had been nothing more than a passing anomaly. In the Swan's Tear, he paused briefly, observing the gentle attentiveness of the patrons, their conversations now tinged with the subdued amusement that accompanies shared understanding of a subtle, elegant social dance. Miss Penrose, quietly cataloguing new arrivals to the shelves, glanced up and allowed the faintest smile, acknowledging the imperceptible influence that had guided both her and the town in their observations over the past week. Purbright returned to his office in mid-afternoon. The streets calm, the usual pattern of small-town life restored. He methodically arranged his notes, now complete with the behavioral cues, minute gestures, and subtle orchestrations that had formed the framework of the week's events. The second incident, the careful test, and the calm reveal had all demonstrated the capacity of one attentive individual to influence perception and reaction without overt intervention. He poured himself a cup of tea, noting the faint sunlight glinting off the rim of the cup, and allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. Flaxborough had, in its usual fashion, absorbed the lessons of civility, observation, and subtle influence. The town's attention, once diverted and uncertain, now rested in a place of calm appreciation for the elegance of human behavior. The week's events had left small, permanent traces: a heightened attentiveness in the market, a quiet acknowledgement of minor gestures, and the subtle awareness that even the most trivial actions might ripple outward in ways previously unnoticed. Yet the overall order of the town remained intact. Civility, curiosity, and polite observation continued as before, tempered by a newfound understanding of the delicate interplay of perception and action. Purbright spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing his ledger, the behavioral sequences carefully recorded and interpreted, confirming that each reaction, each adjustment, each subtle glance had a role in the minor drama now concluded. There was no need for further intervention. The pattern had been revealed, the influence acknowledged, and the town returned to its habitual, comforting rhythm. By evening, he closed the ledger, the lamp casting a soft circle of light over the tidy desk. Outside, Flaxborough's streets quieted under the gentle descent of twilight. The town, as it often did, moved on, carrying the faint memory of minor perturbations and the quiet influence of one composed, perceptive individual, leaving the larger rhythm of life undisturbed. Purbright allowed himself a final glance through the window, noting the serene calm of Market Lane, the subtle rustle of leaves in the gardens, and the dim glow of the Swan's Tear. The week's events, seemingly trivial yet elegantly orchestrated, had resolved without upheaval or scandal. It was, he reflected with mild satisfaction, a testament to the quiet civility, patience, and intelligence that governed both his observations and the town itself. He stood, stretched, and prepared for the next day's paperwork, the lamp glowing softly beside his neatly arranged notes. Flaxborough, for all its ordinary rhythms and polite routines, had offered a rare lesson in the subtle dynamics of perception, attention, and influence, and Purbright, with quiet satisfaction, returned to the small pleasures of his work, assured that the town would carry on, enriched by the gentle understanding of the week's understated mystery.